A bitter wind swept across the hills, scattering dust like forgotten memories. The sun was a pale smear behind thick winter clouds, and below it stood the sagging remnants of what used to be a proud ranch. Fences leaned, wire rusted, and the red paint of the barn had faded into a dull brown, flaking like old scabs. There was no sound but the groan of wood in the wind and the distant howl of a coyote announcing twilight's approach. Jessa had never been this close to the Rourke property before. Her father forbade it. Everyone in 3 counties knew what kind of man Clayton Rourke was. Cruel, stubborn, with eyes like slate and a heart colder than any Wyoming frost. But she'd heard the whispers, low talk in the feed store and sanctuary barn. A sick horse. Starving. Hidden behind the barn where no one would see. She crept through the tall grass, heart pounding, boots sinking into frozen mud. The air smelled of ash and something sour like rotting hay. She knew she was trespassing, but there were worse crimes than crossing a line in the dirt. Letting something die alone, for instance. The first thing she noticed was the silence. No dogs barked. No cattle lowed. Just the wind. She rounded the corner of the barn, her breath misting in front of her, and saw her. The mare was nothing more than bones draped in hide, her coat dull and patchy, spine jutting up like the ridge of a fallen mountain. She stood crookedly as if any shift in weight might break her legs. A frayed rope was tied loosely to a fence post, not enough to restrain, just enough to mock. A shallow trough held slush instead of water. Her eyes were sunken, but they caught Jessa, and in them flickered something far worse than pain. Surrender. Jessa felt her throat tighten. She stepped closer, whispering softly. Hey girl. It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. The horse didn't flinch, didn't move, just watched. Reaching into her coat pocket, Jessa pulled out a handful of oats she'd brought in case the rumors were true. She held it out, inching closer. The mare didn't react at first. Then, slowly, cautiously, her nostrils flared. Her lips twitched. One trembling step forward. Then another. Jessa let the horse eat from her hand, tears stinging her eyes. She was light as a shadow, as though wind might carry her away if she stepped wrong. She ain't yours. The voice cracked like a whip behind her. Jessa spun, heart leaping. Clayton Rourke stood near the barn door, shotgun in one hand, rage in the other. His flannel was open, despite the cold, and his boots were black with old mud. You shouldn't be here, he growled, stepping forward. This is private land. Don't make me tell you again. She's dying, Jessa snapped, fear fighting with fury. You know she is. That horse is mine. And if I wanted her dead, I'd do it myself. He spat into the dirt. Ain't your business. She doesn't deserve this. No one ever does, he muttered, almost too quiet to hear. His eyes drifted toward the mare. You got 5 seconds to get off my land. Jessa clenched her fists. She wanted to scream, to yell at him that he was a monster, that someone should report him. But she didn't. Because people had tried. And nothing changed. Not here. Instead, she looked at the mare, so fragile, so broken, and whispered, I'll come back. I promise. Then she turned and walked away, not daring to run. Clayton didn't follow. The wind did. The ride home was silent. Jessa's hands shook as she clutched the reins of her bike. She should tell her father. But he'd forbid her from going again. He'd been fighting for years to keep their sanctuary afloat, rescuing Mustangs, abandoned colts, abused maras. And he'd tried going up against men like Rourke before. It never ended well. That night, Jessa couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of the tiny bunk above the tack room. Willow's eyes burned into her mind. The name had just come to her. Willow. Thin and fragile, but still bending toward light. The next night she returned. And the next. Always under darkness, always with oats, water, and whatever scraps she could sneak away without her father noticing. She sang sometimes quietly lullabies her mother used to hum when Jessa was young. Songs about rivers and rain and riding fast across golden fields. Willow listened. Slowly she began to lift her head more often. Her ears twitched at sounds. She leaned into Jessa's touch. But nothing changed with Rourke. His eyes never softened. He watched from the barn sometimes, arms crossed, saying nothing. As though daring Jessa to hope. As if daring the mare to try. On the 7th night it rained. Cold, biting, miserable. Jessa still came. She tucked the old wool blanket tighter around Willow's body, brushing her mane, murmuring, You're gonna make it, girl. Just hang on. Lightning split the sky. Thunder growled. And Willow shuddered. Jessa stood and looked at her, really looked. There was still so little of her left. Barely skin, barely breath. But something in her eyes had shifted. Not hope. Not yet. But awareness. The first flicker of resistance. Maybe you remember someone kind, Jessa said softly. Maybe you had someone once. Behind her, the barn creaked. Jessa turned and saw an old hook on the side post where tack used to hang. On a whim, she stepped closer and pushed open the warped door. The smell of damp hay and rusted tools curled in the air. Cobwebs hung like veils. On the far wall, nailed carelessly, was a photo in a splintered frame. Dust dulled the glass, but Jessa wiped it with her sleeve. Her breath caught. A woman, smiling with dark braids and a laughing mouth, stood beside a foal. The foal had the same wide forehead, the same uneven starburst on its brow. She was younger, shinier, full of promise, but it was her. Willow. Footsteps crunched outside. Jessa stepped back from the photo as Clayton entered the barn. He saw her. Saw the frame in her hand. His jaw clenched. Get out. You knew her, Jessa said, voice low. She was hers, wasn't she? Your wife's. Clayton didn't answer. He stared at the photo, something flickering behind his expression. A flicker quickly extinguished. She died because of them, he muttered. Because of that thing. She died in a riding accident, Jessa replied. That's not Willow's fault. Clayton's mouth twitched. You know nothing. I know that she's still trying. After everything you've done to her. He stepped forward suddenly and Jessa flinched. But he didn't raise a hand. He didn't yell. He just looked tired. Leave. Don't come back. I'm not leaving her. You don't have a choice. But Jessa had already made her choice. She walked past him, brushing his shoulder out into the night. Her chest ached, her stomach twisted, but her heart burned with something fierce and terrible. She'd fight. She'd save Willow if it was the last thing she did. Behind her, a low sound broke through the rain. She turned. Willow was down. Legs folded under her, eyes glazed, breath shallow. The blanket clung to her like a shroud. Mud rose around her body like a grave being dug by the sky. Jessa fell to her knees. No, not yet, please. But Willow didn't move. The storm swallowed the night whole. The frost clung to the grass like shattered glass, sharp and brittle beneath Jessa's boots as she crept through the woods behind the Rourke ranch. The storm had passed, but the earth bore its scars. Puddles in the dirt, broken branches, a silence that felt wrong. She'd barely slept since that night. Willow hadn't moved when she left, her body sunken, her breathing faint and fragile. Jessa had prayed the mare would still be alive come morning. She hadn't been able to return until now. If the mare had died during the night, she'd have felt it. Or so she told herself. The sun had barely lifted over the horizon, staining the sky with streaks of orange and gray. Jessa tightened the scarf around her neck and hurried toward the barn, her satchel bouncing against her hip. It held everything she could sneak from the sanctuary: salve for cracked skin, sweet grain, a clean cloth, even a few herbal tinctures her father used for injured foals. She hadn't told him where they were going. When she turned the corner, her breath hitched. Willow was still there. The mare lay curled in the same patch of churned-up mud. Her eyes were closed, but her ears twitched. A pulse of relief surged through Jessa so quickly her knees buckled, and she dropped beside the mare, reaching for her muzzle. You're still with me, she whispered, stroking the coarse hair between Willow's ears. You stubborn, beautiful girl. Willow opened one eye, unfocused and glassy, but she was conscious. It was enough. Jessa pulled a small bottle from her bag and gently touched the mare's dry lips with water infused with peppermint oil. Willow barely responded, but Jessa saw her tongue flicker. I brought you something, she said softly, shaking a small container of oats, then pouring a bit into her palm. Willow sniffed, didn't eat, then sighed through her nostrils like even chewing was too much effort. Jessa sat with her for hours, rubbing warmth into her legs, coaxing her to sip more water, whispering anything that came to mind, memories, stories, songs. Anything to keep Willow tethered to this world. At midday, a shadow fell across them. You're back, Clayton said gruffly. Jessa didn't answer. She continued rubbing the mare's side in slow circles. She should have been dead days ago, he muttered. Jessa looked up at him. But she's not. Clayton squinted at the sky, then back down. He had a worn envelope in one hand. Without a word, he tossed it onto the ground near her and walked away. Curious, Jessa picked it up and opened it. Inside were 3 photos, old, worn and faded by time. The same woman from the barn photo, Clayton's wife, was in each one. In the first, she sat in the grass, brushing a filly's mane. In the second, she rode a grown mare across a field, hair flying, laughing. And in the third, she stood with Clayton, their hands resting on the foal's back. Willow. Jessa stared at them, heart thudding. He hadn't said a word, but this was something. A crack in the armor. A memory that hadn't yet withered. She returned every day. When it snowed. When it rained. She came at night when her father thought she was sleeping, and at dawn when the world was still soft and quiet. Willow didn't die. Slowly she began to live again. The mare began to lift her head. She blinked more often. Her lips curled when Jessa offered water, and eventually she began to chew the oats left by her side. Her body remained weak and skeletal, but her eyes, those began to change. From dull gray to brown flecked with gold. From absent to aware. Jessa started calling her by name aloud, testing the sound. Willow, she'd whisper. Come on, girl. You're stronger than this. One morning she arrived to find Willow standing, wobbly and swaying but upright. Jessa dropped to her knees, tears springing instantly. She reached out to steady the mare. You did it? I knew you would. Behind her a throat cleared. Clayton stood with a bucket of hay. He didn't say anything, just watched as Jessa wept into Willow's neck. Then, without comment, he placed the bucket beside the fence and walked away. Later that day Jessa told her father. He stared at her for a long time across the dinner table, his face unreadable. Then he leaned back and sighed. Clayton Rourke isn't the kind of man who changes. Maybe not, Jessa replied. But maybe the horse can. He rubbed his temples, then stood. If he threatens you again, I'm going to the sheriff. Jessa didn't tell him that part of her no longer feared Clayton. She didn't trust him, not yet, but something had shifted. Each day she visited, the bucket would be there. Sometimes filled with hay. Other times fresh water. He never spoke, never approached. But he watched. And something in the set of his shoulders had softened. Days passed. Willow's cough began to worsen. It was dry, harsh, a rattling sound that came from deep inside. Jessa brought herbs, but they didn't help much. She could tell the illness ran deeper than malnutrition. One day, after a particularly violent bout, Willow coughed up blood. Jessa stared at the ground, stunned. She wiped Willow's mouth and sat back, heart sinking. Her hands trembled. She had done everything she could. Love, patience, care. But it might not be enough. Clayton approached from the other side of the barn. He must have seen the blood because he didn't speak for a while. Finally he asked, "What is it?" "Her lungs," Jessa murmured. "Could be pneumonia. Could be something worse. I don't know. She needs real care. A vet. Medicine. Not just me." Clayton was quiet. "She's not gonna make it if we wait much longer," she said, voice cracking. "You can still do the right thing. She's dying anyway. But she doesn't have to die like this." Clayton's eyes flashed, anger rising. "You think I haven't done enough? You've done nothing," Jessa shouted, stepping toward him. "You tied her out here to rot." His hand curled into a fist, then opened again. He stared at the ground, breathing hard. "You don't understand." "No, I don't. Why are you letting her suffer?" He looked up, and something behind his eyes broke open. "Because she was hers." The words hit the air like thunder. Jessa blinked. "My wife," he said, quieter now. "She loved that filly more than anything. Raised her herself. She died riding out to find Willow when she got spooked during a storm. Broke her neck on the rocks. I buried them both that night, my wife in the ground and the horse inside a pen." Jessa's anger cooled. Her breath came in ragged sighs. "You blamed her." "I hated her," he admitted. "But I couldn't finish it. Couldn't let her go either." Jessa looked at him and for the first time, saw not just a cruel man but a broken one. Twisted by guilt. Paralyzed by grief. She stepped forward and put a hand gently on his arm. "She's still alive. That means something. Maybe it means it's not too late." Clayton didn't respond, but his silence no longer felt like stone. It felt like a dam about to break. That night, Jessa returned to the sanctuary alone. She walked through the paddocks, trailing her fingers along the fence rails. The air was cold and stars scattered above her like scattered seeds. She passed a group of foals curled in the straw, their breath rising in soft puffs. She stopped beside one pen, watched a young chestnut stretch and sigh, then curl tighter. She thought of Willow lying out there in the dark, fighting for every breath, and of the man haunted by what he couldn't undo. The next morning, before the sun had touched the hills, she loaded a cart with supplies. Real medicine, antibiotics, bandages, a heated blanket. If Clayton wouldn't bring a vet, she would bring what she had. Willow had come too far to be left behind now. When she arrived, she found something she never expected. The bucket was already there. Beside it, a blanket. And leaning against the fence post, an unopened bottle of penicillin. Jessa stared at it, her breath catching in her chest. She didn't know how he got it. Didn't ask. But when she looked up at the house on the hill, she saw Clayton at the window watching. She raised her hand. He didn't wave back. But he didn't look away either. The wind that night howled like an injured creature, clawing at the barn's wooden slats and tearing through the trees with a rage that seemed almost sentient. Jessa sat curled in the corner of Willow's stall, her coat wrapped tightly around her and a lantern flickering beside her. The storm had been building all afternoon, angry clouds gathering, thunder pulsing in distant waves. The forecast warned of flash floods and lightning strikes, and her father had pleaded with her not to go out. But when Clayton didn't answer her calls, she knew something was wrong. Willow had taken a turn that morning. Her breaths had grown shallower, more strained, and her eyes no longer tracked Jessa's movements the way they used to. Despite the antibiotics and the warmth and the food, her strength had begun to bleed away again. Jessa felt it slipping through her fingers. The mare lay on her side now, ribs rising and falling with slow, painful effort. Jessa stroked her gently, whispering lullabies from childhood, her voice trembling with every note. Outside the rain came in sheets. The roof groaned and the walls shook. Somewhere a tree cracked and splintered. Then the first flash lit the sky. Jessa rose, heart pounding. She peeked through the barn doors, saw the dark silhouette of the Rourke house in the distance and something else, light. Not from the windows. From the roof. A moment later she saw the smoke. Fire, she gasped. The wind had carried it fast. Lightning must have struck the upper part of the structure. Flames licked across the shingles, wild and orange, spitting embers into the stormy sky. She could just barely see someone, Clayton, stumbling out the back door, clutching something close to his chest. "Willow," Jessa whispered, turning back. The mare blinked at her slowly. If the fire spread, the barn was next. The storm had weakened the ground. If a lightning strike didn't get them, the floodwaters would. They had minutes, maybe less. She reached into her pocket and fumbled for her phone. No signal. No flashlight either. The battery had died hours ago. She grabbed the lantern and threw open the stall door. "Come on," she said, sliding her arms beneath Willow's neck. "I need you to stand." The mare didn't move. Jessa gritted her teeth. "Please." She pressed her shoulder against the mare's flank and pushed, gently at first, then with more urgency. Willow groaned. Her legs trembled. She shifted slightly, then collapsed again with a muffled thud. "No," Jessa whispered. "Don't you do this." Lightning cracked directly overhead. The barn glowed for an instant like a ghost rising from the earth. A second later, the thunder slammed through the valley like a cannon blast. The ground shook. Jessa heard something behind her, water. The creek that wound through the Rourke property had spilled its banks. A rushing wall of dark, churning liquid poured across the fields, sweeping debris in its path. She saw fence posts, buckets, even a trough tumbling in the flow. She turned back to Willow. Her hands shook as she unlatched the halter, slipped it on, and whispered, "You don't have to run. Just walk. Just stand with me." Another push. Willow groaned again. Then, slowly she shifted her weight. One leg. Then another. Her hooves slipped on the wet straw, but she kept moving. Inch by inch she struggled to her feet. Jessa sobbed. "Good girl." She grabbed the lead rope and started toward the door. The water had reached the paddock now. It surged around her calves, bitter cold and fast. Willow stumbled behind her, snorting, nostrils flaring. Jessa tugged, encouraging, coaxing, praying. Just a little further. She aimed for the old ridge trail behind the barn, the high ground. It was narrow and steep, but it might be dry. Willow hesitated as they reached the fence line, eyes wild with fear. Behind them, lightning split the sky again. The barn caught. Flames roared to life along the edge of the roof. The drywood went up like kindling. Smoke poured out in thick black coils. Heat pressed against their backs. Jessa cried out and pulled harder. Willow lurched forward, hooves thrashing against the mud. Then another figure appeared through the haze. Clayton. He staggered down the slope, soaked and coughing, his shirt streaked with ash and soot. When he saw them, his face crumpled, not in anger or confusion but in sheer, blinding relief. "You got her," he rasped. "Barely," Jessa called. He reached them in seconds and grabbed the halter beside her. Without a word they pushed together, guiding, hauling, pleading. The water surged higher, now knee-deep. Willow slipped once more but didn't fall. Somehow, impossibly, she kept going. Up the ridge. Step by aching step. By the time they reached the top, the barn was gone, just a pillar of flame roaring and crackling, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The house below it was smoking but spared for now. They collapsed together in the wet grass. Jessa's body ached. Her hands were raw, her lungs stung. Willow stood between them, legs quivering, breath rasping, but alive. "You saved her," Clayton said, not looking at her. "We did," Jessa corrected, her voice hollow with exhaustion. For a long time neither of them spoke. The rain eased, the wind began to die, and the floodwaters below started to recede. Eventually Clayton said, "There's a stable up at the old mine trail. Empty. Dry. We can take her there." Jessa nodded slowly. "She won't last another storm." "I'll carry the supplies," he added. "You lead her." The truce had no ceremony, no handshake or hug. But it was there, in the way they moved together, the way they didn't question each other anymore. Something had burned down that night. But something else had been built in the smoke's shadow. They reached the old mine trail by dawn. The stable was rough but solid. It took hours to warm Willow up and get her settled, but once she was lying on a dry bed of hay, her breath more even, Jessa leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Clayton stood near the door, watching the storm fade into blue sky. He looked older now, stripped bare. But there was peace in his posture. "She reminds me of her," he said quietly. "Of my wife." Jessa turned to him. "She fought too," he added. "Right until the end." Jessa stepped over and put her hand on Willow's side. The mare twitched but didn't wake. "I think," she said softly, "maybe she came back. Through her." Clayton didn't answer. But he stayed beside them. Until the morning turned gold and quiet, and Willow began to dream. The spring sun warmed the land as if trying to erase the memory of the flood, but the scars remained. The valley had changed. Muddy grooves where pastures once lay, blackened wood where the barn had stood, fences twisted like broken ribs. Yet something new stirred in its place, quiet and unexpected. It had been 4 weeks since the storm. Willow still limped but walked without help now, her ribs no longer visible beneath her coat. Her eyes, once dull with fever, had reclaimed a flicker of their old fire. The stable at the old mine trail had become her sanctuary, and Jessa's. Every morning, Jessa came early before the sun cleared the ridge, bringing oats and apples and warm cloths for Willow's legs. She sang as she worked, not loudly, but just enough to settle the mare's restless energy. It was a ritual now, one neither of them would break. Clayton came too, though always later. He kept his distance at first, working silently, replacing fence posts, hauling hay, fixing the old pump. But the air between them had shifted. They no longer pretended not to see each other. When Jessa left at night, she often found an extra blanket folded on the rail or fresh water already filled. Clayton said little, but his actions spoke louder than his silence ever had. Jessa no longer feared him. And in truth she no longer hated him. What he had done to the other animals she could never forget. But in the days that followed the flood, she began to understand the loneliness that had driven him. And the guilt. It was in the way he spoke to Willow now, low and gentle, asking her if she needed more hay or if the wind had kept her up. Once, Jessa overheard him murmuring, "You're stronger than I ever was." But Willow wasn't out of danger. The infection had weakened her heart, and the vet warned that any major strain could undo all they had worked for. She needed peace. Rest. But there was one more obstacle neither Jessa nor Clayton had foreseen. The ranch had been sold. The new landowners were coming in a week. They had big plans, solar fields, equipment storage, maybe even livestock for meat. No room for a sickly mare with a history, no matter how miraculous her survival. The stable was on the edge of the property and had been overlooked for years. But once the surveyors arrived, they'd find it. And then Willow would have nowhere left to go. Jessa had tried every rescue within 3 counties. No one had space. No one had funds. They offered sympathy, sometimes encouragement, but always ended with a regretful no. That evening, as the sky burned orange behind the hills, she sat beside Willow and wept. "I can't save you again," she whispered. "I don't have anything left." The mare nuzzled her hand gently as if sensing her despair. Jessa stayed until the stars appeared. Then she rose and turned to leave and froze. Clayton stood just beyond the doorway, holding something wrapped in a wool cloth. "I heard," he said, stepping forward. "About the buyers." Jessa nodded, wiping her face quickly. "They won't keep her." "I know." He unwrapped the cloth and held it out. Inside was a photograph, faded and creased, the edges worn from being handled too often. A woman with fire-colored hair and a smile that felt like sunshine. She stood beside a black foal, almost a mirror of Willow. In the corner of the photo, a name had been written in looping ink, "Aurora." "Your wife?" Jessa asked softly. Clayton nodded. "She loved that foal. Nursed her back to life after her mother died. Said horses could carry burdens people couldn't speak aloud. His voice cracked. I didn't understand then. I do now. Jessa held the photo like something sacred. There's a fund, he continued. My wife's trust. I've never used it. Didn't think I deserved to. But maybe it wasn't meant for me. Her heart pounded. What are you saying? We'll buy the stable back. Or at least enough land around it. I spoke with the agent today. They'll sell if it's not too much. I can cover the down payment. Jessa stared at him, disbelief rippling through her like wind over water. But why? She asked. After everything? Clayton looked at Willow, who stood peacefully in the fading light. Because I need her to live. And I need you to forgive me. Even if I don't deserve it. Jessa looked away, tears threatening again. But they weren't just tears of grief anymore. I don't know if I can, she whispered. Not completely. I don't expect you to, he replied. But maybe we can both start over. In the same place. For her. The next days passed in a blur of negotiations, paperwork, and planning. Clayton used every favor he still had left in town. Jessa wrote to the rescues again, this time with a new offer. A safe haven long-term with room to expand. 2 small donors responded, offering supplies and food. A vet clinic donated old medical equipment. It wasn't everything. But it was a beginning. On the morning the buyers arrived, the deal had already gone through. The stable, the ridge trail, and 3 acres of land saved. The new owners, surprised but unbothered, redirected their plans. Jessa watched from the hilltop as they drove past, unaware of how close they'd come to erasing a miracle. And then the miracle happened. That afternoon, Jessa was brushing Willow's coat when she noticed something strange, movement near the mare's side. A ripple beneath the surface. She froze, placed her hand there. Another movement. A definite kick. She stumbled backward, breath catching in her throat. Clayton stepped forward. What is it? Jessa couldn't speak for a moment. She only pointed. Willow flicked her tail and looked back at them, innocent. She's pregnant, Jessa finally said. Clayton's eyes widened. But, the vet said. She must have been already. It was too early to see. The sickness didn't take the foal. Her voice broke with wonder. She's going to be a mother. They stood there, silent, the late sunlight wrapping around them like a warm embrace. It wasn't just survival now. It was life. New life. A foal. A future. The community rallied around them. Donations grew. Volunteers came to help build new fencing, plant grass, repair the feed room. Word of Willow's survival, and the foal, spread. The local paper ran a feature titled Asterisk, the mare who refused to die. Asterisk, a school teacher, brought her class up to learn about healing, resilience, and kindness. And Jessa? She stayed. She no longer needed to run from the valley or her grief. Her mother's memory lived on here, in the wind, the fields, and now in a black mare who once lay dying in the mud. Every hoofprint Willow made was a reminder that hope can rise from ruin. One evening, months later, as stars blinked awake and Willow nuzzled her newborn foal in the soft hay, Jessa leaned against the stable wall beside Clayton. She's perfect, she whispered. She is, he agreed. The foal stretched her legs and took a wobbly step, then another, until she stood steady beside her mother. Her coat shimmered like ink in the moonlight, and a white star glowed on her forehead. What will you name her? Clayton asked. Jessa smiled. Aurora. The man who once caused pain, and the girl who once ran from it, watched as the future took its first steps into the world, small, unsteady, but glowing with promise. And the valley, for the first time in a long while, breathed easy again.